What if the one moment you needed kindness the most turned into your worst humiliation? Jake just wanted to buy his son a birthday cake. Instead, he was mocked, embarrassed, and told to leave. But just when things seemed hopeless, a deep voice cut through the tension. That's how y'all treat customers? The entire bakery went silent, because standing there, arms crossed, was none other than Shaquille O'Neal, and he was not happy. What happened next? No one in that bakery saw it coming. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Jake's fingers tighten around his worn-out wallet, his knuckles turning white. He doesn't even need to open it. He already knows what's inside. Barely a few crumpled bills, a couple of coins, not enough. But today is different. Today is Ethan's birthday, and Jake refuses to let his son down. The streets are alive with the warm glow of shop windows. It's a chilly evening, and the crisp autumn air carries the rich scent of freshly baked bread and chocolate from a nearby bakery. Ethan, just 6 years old, skips beside his father, humming a little tune. His small hand tugs on Jake's sleeve, his face lighting up as they pass the bakery window. "Dad, look! That one!" Ethan exclaims, pressing his tiny hands against the glass. His breath fogs up the surface as he stares in awe at a beautifully decorated chocolate cake sitting proudly on display. Golden swirls of icing wrap around its edges, and delicate chocolate shavings rest on top, glistening under the bakery's warm lighting. A perfect birthday cake. A cake that, for a child like Ethan, represents happiness, celebration, and love. Jake forces a smile, his heart tightening in his chest. He already knows there's no way they can afford that cake. But how does he tell his son that? "Looks amazing, buddy," Jake says, ruffling Ethan's dark curls. "Come on, let's go inside." The moment they step into the bakery, they're greeted with the intoxicating aroma of fresh pastries and sweet vanilla. The display cases are filled with vibrant cupcakes, golden croissants, and decadent cakes, each one more tempting than the last. Ethan bounces on his toes, his eyes darting between the different treats, completely unaware of his father's growing anxiety. Jake discreetly pulls out his wallet, flipping it open with his thumb. He does a quick count, his pulse quickening. Maybe if he finds something small, just enough to make Ethan feel special. "Excuse me, sir." Jake looks up. A cashier, a woman with sharp eyes and an impatient expression, stands behind the counter. Her name tag reads Lisa. She's tapping her nails against the register, her face already showing disinterest. "What can I get for you?" she asks, her tone flat. Jake clears his throat. "Hey, my son's birthday is today." He gestures toward Ethan, who's too busy admiring the cakes to notice the tension in his father's voice. "I was wondering if—" "That one, Dad, the chocolate one!" Ethan interrupts excitedly, pointing at the exact cake from the window. Jake's stomach sinks. Lisa follows his gaze and smirks. "Good choice. That'll be $65. Jake's breath hitches. $65? He looks down at the money in his hand, his fingers trembling as he counts. $32. That's all he has. A wave of embarrassment crashes over him. Jake swallows hard, his throat dry. Do you have anything a little smaller?" Lisa raises an eyebrow, the smirk still lingering on her face. "Sir, this isn't a thrift store," she says, her voice loud enough for others in the bakery to hear. A few customers glance over, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Ethan tugs on his father's sleeve, sensing something is wrong. "Dad?" he whispers. Jake forces himself to smile, trying to keep the shame from showing on his face. But deep down, a familiar fear gnaws at him, the fear of disappointing his son. Ethan bounces on his feet, his small hands gripping the counter as he beams up at the cashier. His excitement is contagious, his eyes sparkling with joy. "That one, Dad, the chocolate one!" he exclaims, pointing at the decadent cake in the display case. He has no idea that his father's heart is pounding, that Jake is doing mental gymnastics, trying to figure out how he can make this happen. No idea that money is tight, no idea that birthdays aren't supposed to feel like this. Lisa, the cashier, lets out a sigh, sharp and impatient. She doesn't even glance at Ethan's eager face. Instead, she focuses on Jake, her fingers drumming against the register. "That'll be $65, she says flatly. Jake's throat tightens. He already knows it's too much, knows he doesn't have enough, knows this moment is slipping out of his hands. Still, he reaches into his pocket, pulling out his wallet with slow, deliberate movements, as if somehow, some way, the money will have magically multiplied since the last time he checked. He flips it open. $32. His fingers tremble slightly as he counts it again, hoping, praying, that he miscalculated. He didn't. His stomach churns. Jake clears his throat, forcing himself to stay calm. Is there maybe a smaller cake? Something more affordable? Lisa raises an eyebrow, tilting her head like she didn't hear him correctly. Smaller, she repeats, her voice laced with amusement. A couple standing in line behind them exchange looks. A man chuckles under his breath. A woman whispers something to her friend, both of them stealing glances at Jake and his son. Ethan's smile starts to fade. Lisa crosses her arms, her lips curling into a smirk. We don't do cheap cakes here, she says, her tone sharp. Maybe try the clearance rack in the back. A couple of customers snicker. Jake feels heat creeping up his neck, humiliation tightening around his chest like a vice. His hands ball into fists, but he forces himself to breathe. Ethan tugs on his father's sleeve, his voice small now. Dad, what does clearance mean? Jake's jaw clenches. It doesn't matter, buddy, he says, reaching for Ethan's hand, ready to leave. But Lisa isn't done. She leans slightly over the counter, lowering her voice but making sure it's still loud enough for everyone around them to hear. If you can't afford it, she sneers, maybe you shouldn't have come in at all. Jake inhales sharply, his grip tightening around Ethan's small hand. His mind screams at him to walk away, to take his son and leave, to forget about the cake. But before he can move, a deep, commanding voice cuts through the tension like a blade. That's how you all treat customers? The entire bakery falls silent. All eyes turn toward the man who just spoke. And Jake, he feels his breath hitch in his throat. Because standing there, arms crossed, towering over everyone in the room, is Shaquille O'Neal. The line behind Jake grows longer, a mix of impatient sighs and quiet murmurs filling the air. The scent of fresh pastries, once comforting, now feels suffocating. Ethan's wide-eyed excitement dims as he glances between his father and the cashier. He doesn't understand why his dad isn't just paying for the cake. He doesn't understand the sharp looks from the people behind them. But he understands one thing. Something is wrong. Jake forces himself to take a breath. His pride is in his throat, choking him, but he won't let his son see his struggle. He swallows hard and tries again. Maybe you have something smaller? A cupcake or… Lisa, the cashier, sighs loudly, tilting her head back as if this is the greatest inconvenience of her life. We don't do charity, she cuts him off. Her voice carries across the bakery, ensuring everyone hears. A few chuckles ripple through the line. Jake doesn't turn around, but he feels their judgment, their amusement at his expense. A middle-aged man behind him scoffs, shaking his head. If you can't afford a cake, why even come here? Another woman murmurs to her friend, loud enough for Jake to hear. Some people just don't belong in places like this. Ethan tugs at Jake's sleeve, his voice small. Daddy? Jake's stomach twists. He grips his son's hand, squeezing it gently, forcing a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. It's okay, bud, he says softly. We'll find something else. But as he turns to leave, Lisa lets out a mocking tisk. You know, she says, crossing her arms, I don't get why people come in here acting like they belong, making a scene, expecting handouts. Jake freezes. His fingers tighten around his wallet. His breath slows. Ethan, too young to fully grasp the weight of Lisa's words, simply looks up at his father. But he knows. He knows his dad's smile isn't real anymore. He knows his dad's shoulders feel heavier than before. Maybe try a supermarket, Lisa adds on, smirking. They have cakes for your kind of budget. Another soft laugh from someone behind him. A cough, an awkward shuffle. No one speaks up. Jake clenches his fists at his sides, willing himself to stay calm. But before he can move, before he can do or say anything, a deep, commanding voice cuts through the tension like a blade. That's how y'all treat customers? The entire bakery falls silent. Jake blinks. Ethan grips his father's hand a little tighter. Lisa's smug expression falters as she slowly turns toward the entrance. And standing there, arms crossed, towering over everyone in the room, is Shaquille O'Neal. The laughter dies instantly. A thick, uncomfortable silence blankets the bakery as all eyes turn toward the entrance. That's how y'all treat customers? The voice is deep, smooth, and full of quiet authority. It cuts through the room like a thunderclap, shaking the confidence of those who had just been mocking a struggling father. Jake freezes, barely daring to turn around. Ethan, gripping his father's hand, blinks in confusion. Lisa, the cashier, stiffens, her smirk vanishing as recognition dawns on her face. The man at the entrance takes a slow, pushes the cake box forward, but she still refuses to meet anyone's eyes. The once smug cashier now stood under the heavy weight of Shaquille O'Neal's towering presence. Here, she mutters, forcing a tight-lipped smile. It's all yours. But Shaq doesn't take it. Instead, he crosses his arms and raises an eyebrow. That doesn't sound like you mean it. Lisa's fake smile vanishes. She shifts her weight from foot to foot, eyes darting to the customers who had once laughed at Jake. Now, they were silent, watching her squirm. Say it properly, Shaq says, his deep voice calm, but firm. Like you mean it. Lisa's jaw tightens. I already said it, she mumbles, still not making eye contact. Shaq tilts his head slightly, studying her. No, you didn't. A hush falls over the bakery. Even the sound of the cash register humming in the background seems louder than her words. Jake, standing protectively beside Ethan, watches with wary eyes. He had been humiliated in front of these same people. Now it was Lisa's turn. Lisa's fingers twitch on the counter. Her throat bobs as she swallows. Finally, after what feels like forever, she sighs and speaks louder. I'm sorry, she says, her voice still tight but clear. For what? Shaq presses. Lisa's face burns red. I'm sorry, what for embarrassing you, she says, glancing at Jake. And? Shaq prompts, not letting her off the hook. Lisa lets out a sharp exhale, clearly struggling with her pride. And for being rude, she says through clenched teeth. Jake nods once but says nothing. Ethan, still holding the cake box, beams up at Shaq. Now that's better, Shaq finally says, satisfied. Maybe next time, you'll treat people right the first time. Lisa nods stiffly, clearly eager for this to be over. One of the same women who had mocked Jake earlier now stood awkwardly behind Shaq, shifting on her heels. An older man in a suit, who had chuckled at Jake's struggles before, clears his throat and looks away. The customers who had once sided with Lisa were now feeling the sting of guilt. A mother holding her daughter's hand whispers something to her child, perhaps a quiet lesson about kindness. It wasn't just Lisa who had learned a lesson today. The air in the bakery feels different now, thicker, heavier. But Shaq? He's done with the lecture. His face softens as he looks down at Ethan, who clutches the cake like a prized treasure. Shaq leans down, resting one massive hand on his knee so he's at the boy's eye level. How about we make this birthday even better? Shaq asks, his tone lighter now. Ethan's eyes go wide. How? He asks excitedly. Shaq grins. What else you want, little man? Ethan hesitates, glancing at his father. Jake gives him a small nod. Then Ethan looks back at Shaq with hopeful eyes. I always wanted a basketball, he says shyly. Shaq chuckles. That's so? Lisa blinks, her face turning even paler. Because if there was one person in the world who could make that happen, it was Shaquille O'Neal. Ethan clutches the cake box tightly, his small fingers gripping the edges as if it were the most precious thing in the world. But when Shaq kneels down and asks, What else you want, little man? Ethan hesitates. He glances up at his father, uncertainty flickering in his bright eyes. Finally, he looks back at Shaq and whispers, I always wanted a basketball. For a moment, the entire bakery seems to pause. Shaq's lips curl into a knowing grin. A basketball, huh? He says, stroking his chin playfully. That's a solid choice. You got game, little man? Ethan's face lights up brighter than the candles on his cake. He nods eagerly. I practiced with a flat one at home, but I never had a real one. Jake stiffens slightly, the words cutting deeper than his son realizes. Shaq notices. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out his phone. You know what? He says, tapping the screen. How about I get you one, and maybe teach you some moves? Ethan's mouth drops open. You mean, like really? The bakery gasps. A woman in the back whispers, Is this actually happening? Lisa, the cashier, sways slightly on her feet. Shaq grins and nods. Real talk, little man, he says. Not only am I getting you a basketball, but I'll make sure you get some pro-level training too. Ethan blinks rapidly, as if trying to make sure this isn't a dream. His tiny hands tighten around the cake box, his whole body buzzing with excitement. You serious? Jake finally asks, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq shrugs like it's no big deal. Man, you gotta know by now. I don't play when it comes to the kids. Jake swallows hard, blinking back the sting in his eyes. For months, he'd been barely scraping by. For months, he had felt like he was failing his son. And now? Now, some stranger, no, not just a stranger, but one of the biggest legends alive, was standing in front of him, offering his son something he never could. A real chance. A moment to dream. Jake clears his throat. I don't even know how to thank you. He says, voice thick. Shaq waves a hand. Don't even sweat it. Shaq slowly stands to his full height and turns back toward Lisa, who looks like she wants to disappear. He crosses his arms, towering over the counter. And you? he asks, his voice calm but firm. Lisa flinches. Shaq tilts his head. You ever treat a kid like that again? Lisa shakes her head quickly. No, sir, she stammers, her voice almost a whisper. Shaq doesn't blink. Good. He glances down at Ethan and winks. Now, Shaq says, let's go get you that basketball. Ethan laughs with pure joy. Lisa? She just watches as the man she mocked walks out, standing taller than she ever could. Lisa stiffens as the heavy silence in the bakery deepens. The tension hangs thick in the air, like the scent of fresh pastries, except now, it's far from sweet. Then footsteps approach. A stern voice cuts through the hush. What the hell is going on here? Lisa's manager, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and a sharp, no-nonsense look, steps forward. And from the fire in his eyes, it's clear he saw everything. Lisa visibly swallows, avoiding eye contact. But the manager, he's furious. Mr. O'Neal, he begins, his voice controlled but tense. I sincerely apologize for my employee's behavior. He doesn't even glance at Lisa. Instead, he looks straight at Jake and Ethan, his brows furrowing with genuine regret. We pride ourselves on being a family-friendly establishment, he continues. This should have never happened. Lisa shifts uneasily beside the register, her fingers gripping the counter. The bakery customers, some of whom had laughed earlier, now look away in shame. Shaq simply folds his arms, waiting. The manager sighs heavily before turning back to Ethan. Young man, as an apology, I'd like to offer you a lifetime discount here at our bakery. Ethan's eyes widen. Really? The manager nods. Yes. From now on, anytime you walk through these doors, you'll never have to worry about a price tag. Jake blinks in disbelief, struggling to process the sudden turn of events. The customers murmur among themselves, the weight of the moment sinking in. Lisa, however, looks pale. She can feel the heat of Shaq's gaze on her. She shifts uncomfortably, her fingers twitching nervously. Finally, she clears her throat and speaks, her voice quieter than before. I was just following store policy. Shaq tilts his head, unimpressed. Policy? His deep voice rumbles like distant thunder. Lisa nods quickly. Yes, But the manager cuts her off. Don't even try it, he snaps. Lisa's shoulders slump. I didn't mean to be cruel, she mutters, but the words feel hollow. Shaq exhales slowly, shaking his head. See? That's the problem, he says. You didn't mean to be cruel, but you were. Lisa's face flushes red. You looked at a father struggling to buy his kid a birthday cake, Shaq continues, his voice steady but firm. And instead of helping, you chose to humiliate him. Lisa lowers her gaze. The manager steps in, voice firm. We don't treat people like that, Lisa. Lisa looks cornered, but also shaken. For the first time, she seems to truly realize the impact of her actions. She glances at Ethan, who is still clutching the cake box, his innocent eyes watching her carefully. And that's when the weight of what she did finally hits her. Her throat tightens. I'm sorry, she says softly. Jake nods slowly, but there's still an edge of pain in his expression. Shaq watches her for a long moment. Then he sighs. You want to apologize, he asks? Then prove it. Lisa blinks. How? Shaq gestures to Ethan. Start by serving this little man his cake with a smile. Lisa stiffens. The customers fall silent again, waiting to see what she'll do. For a moment, it looks like she might refuse, but then she exhales shakily and nods. Lisa carefully places the cake inside a bag. Her voice is measured but different this time. Happy birthday, kid, she says, looking at Ethan, really looking at him. Ethan hesitates, then grins. Jake exhales, tension leaving his shoulders for the first time that night. Shaq? He smiles but shakes his head. It ain't about free cake, he says, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. It's about respect. The customers nod in agreement, and Lisa, she just looks down, realizing it may have taken a legend to teach her what she should have known all along. The bakery door chimes softly as Shaq, Jake, and Ethan step out into the cool night air. Inside, the tension is still thick. Lisa stands behind the counter, shoulders tense, face pale. But she doesn't know yet. She doesn't know that her actions have already left the bakery's four walls, and the whole world is about to find out. At a corner table, a young woman wearing a hoodie grins down at her phone. Her fingers fly across the screen as she adds a caption to the video she just recorded. Shaq just taught this rude cashier a lesson she'll never forget. Respect to Canarish's Shaq for president. She hits post. Within seconds, the notifications flood in. No way this is real. Shaq's a legend. Bro, this lady's attitude is disgusting. I hope the dad and his kid are okay. That cashier needs to be fired. The views start climbing fast. Within minutes, the video is trending. Within an hour, the bakery's name is plastered across the internet. And Lisa? Her face is everywhere. Outside, Shaq and Jake are laughing softly as Ethan bounces a brand new basketball. Did you see her face when you paid for the cake? Jake chuckles, shaking his head. Shaq smirks. Bet she won't be talking down to anyone again. But inside the bakery, Lisa refreshes the bakery's Instagram page and freezes. The comment section is a war zone. I was gonna visit this bakery, but not after seeing how they treat people. Who's the rude cashier? Fire her as soon as possible. Shaq is a real one for standing up for that dad and kid. Lisa's hands start to sweat. She clicks the video link. And there it is. A close-up of her rolling her eyes at Jake. A shot of her mocking Ethan's excitement. And worst of all, Shaq's deep, disappointed voice calling her out. The video already has over 1 million views. Lisa's stomach drops. The bakery's owner, who had been silent until now, suddenly bursts out of his office. What the hell is happening? He demands, holding up his phone. Lisa opens her mouth to speak, but he cuts her off. Do you have any idea how bad this is? He growls. We're getting hundreds of negative reviews in real time. Lisa gulps. The bakery's Google rating is plummeting. It was a solid 4.8 stars before tonight. Now, it's at 2.3 and still dropping. The manager pinches his nose. We need to do something. Fast. Lisa nods quickly. We can post an apology. The manager glares at her. Not we, you. 15 minutes later, a post appears on the bakery's social media pages. We sincerely apologize for the recent incident involving one of our employees. The behavior shown does not reflect our values. Steps are being taken to correct this matter. But the internet, it's not buying it. You're only sorry because you got caught. Apologize to the dad and his son, not just your PR team. Where's the rude cashier? She needs to apologize. Lisa leans back in her chair, shaking. No matter how many times she refreshes the page, the hate keeps pouring in. And for the first time, she realizes she isn't just some cashier at a small bakery. She's now the face of cruelty, the villain of a viral moment. And there's no taking it back. The bakery's doors slowly close as Lisa watches Shaq and his new friends disappear down the street. Her phone vibrates violently in her pocket. Messages, emails, notifications. She doesn't check because she knows exactly what they're saying. And for the first time all night, she isn't smiling anymore. The glow from Jake's phone screen flickers across his tired face as he sits on the couch scrolling. Ethan is beside him, cross-legged on the floor, gripping his new basketball like it's the most precious thing in the world. On the screen, the now viral video plays again. Shaq's voice booms through the tiny speakers. Calm, powerful, unforgettable. You never know who you're talking to. Jake exhales, shaking his head in amazement. That man didn't have to help us. His voice is quiet, almost to himself. But he did. Ethan looks up, his eyes still wide with excitement. But he did, he repeats, grinning. The bakery incident had been the worst and best moment of their day. Jake had walked in there feeling small, ashamed of how little he had. Now, his son was laughing, clutching a ball Shaq had bought just for him. And that cake, that beautiful chocolate cake, sat on the kitchen counter, waiting for them to finally celebrate Ethan's birthday properly. All because one person chose to step in. Jake rubs his forehead, still overwhelmed. I don't get it, he mutters. A guy like him? He could have just ignored us, walked away. But instead, Ethan bounces the basketball once, watching it roll back into his hands. Maybe, he says thoughtfully. That's why he's Shaq. Jake lets out a soft chuckle. Yeah, kid, maybe that's why. The next morning, Jake wakes up to hundreds of messages. His phone buzzes nonstop. Texts from old friends, social media notifications, even missed calls from unknown numbers. The bakery's statement is everywhere. Effective immediately, our bakery is implementing a new policy. No discrimination ever. Every customer will be treated with respect, regardless of their financial situation. We sincerely apologize for the incident and are taking steps to ensure this never happens again. Underneath the post, comments flood in. Good, but maybe you should have done this before the internet forced you to. Respect to Shaq for calling them out. Hope the dad and his kid are doing okay. Jake stares at it, shaking his head. It was a start, but one policy doesn't erase what happened. And it definitely doesn't erase the look on Lisa's face when she realized the world had turned against her. As Jake sets his phone down, it buzzes again. He sighs, expecting another news notification. But the caller ID makes him freeze. Hesitantly, he answers. Hello? A deep, familiar voice comes through the line. Jake? Jake's breath catches in his throat. It's Shaq. Got a minute? Shaq asks casually. Jake stammers. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Shaq chuckles. Good, he says, because I might have just found you a job. Jake's jaw drops. His heart pounds. And just like that, his life is about to change again. Jake straightens his tie for the third time, his hands slightly shaking as he stares at his reflection in the glass door of the corporate office. He still can't believe this is happening. Just days ago, he was counting crumpled bills in his wallet, unsure if he could even afford a cake for Ethan's birthday. And now, he's about to walk into an interview at one of the biggest companies in town. Jake takes a deep breath and pushes the door open. The receptionist greets him with a polite smile. Good morning, sir. You're here for the interview with Mr. Reynolds? He nods, still unsure how his life has flipped so fast. After a few minutes of waiting, a tall, well-dressed man steps into the lobby. He looks important. Mr. Jake Harris? The man asks. Jake stands immediately. Yes, sir. The man extends a firm handshake. I'm Richard Reynolds, CEO of this company. It's good to meet you. Jake shakes his hand, trying not to let his nerves show. As they walk toward the office, Mr. Reynolds chuckles. You know, Shaq personally recommended you for this position. Jake nearly stops in his tracks. Wait, what? The CEO nods. He called me himself, said you were a hardworking man who deserved a real shot. And when Shaq calls, you listen. Jake doesn't know what to say. His throat tightens. No one, not a single person, had ever gone out of their way to help him like this. They enter the office and Jake is ready to prove himself. He expects tough questions, maybe even a grilling. But instead, Mr. Reynolds leans back in his chair and says, Tell me about yourself. Jake swallows hard. Well, I've worked a lot of different jobs. Some construction, some warehouse work, and before my wife passed, I managed inventory at a local grocery store. Reynolds nods, listening. I've always worked hard, Jake continues, but life hasn't exactly gone my way. For the next few minutes, Jake opens up, not complaining, just telling the truth. Mr. Reynolds doesn't interrupt. He just listens. When Jake finishes, the CEO leans forward. You remind me of my father, he says. He started with nothing, too. Built this company from the ground up. Jake is silent. Then Reynolds smiles. You're hired. Jake freezes. What? Reynolds chuckles. You expected a longer interview? Shaq already told me everything I need to know. He doesn't vouch for just anyone. Jake barely manages to breathe. After so many years of struggle, his luck had finally changed. Lisa scrolls through her phone, her face pale as she reads the hundreds of comments under the viral video. Some are calling for her to be fired. Others are mocking her arrogance. And the worst part, her boss saw everything. The door to the bakery office swings open. Lisa, the manager says, shaking his head. We need to talk. She knows what's coming. The same way she had mocked Jake for struggling, she now faced the same uncertainty. No job, no security, and no one coming to save her. That evening, the entire world sees Shaq's final post about the incident. A simple message, one sentence. Be kind. You never know who you're talking to. The post goes viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a cake. It was about respect, and the world was listening. Jake arrives home, still in shock. He kneels beside Ethan, ruffling his son's hair. Guess what, buddy? What? Ethan grins. I got the job. Ethan throws his arms around his father. Best birthday ever. The night sky was clear, a blanket of stars twinkling above, as laughter echoed from the small apartment. Inside, the glow of a single candle flickered against the walls. Ethan clapped his hands in excitement as he stared at the beautifully decorated chocolate cake sitting on their worn-out wooden table. Just hours ago, this moment had seemed impossible, and now it was a birthday to remember. Jake sat beside his son, watching him with quiet amazement. He still couldn't believe it. The kindness of a stranger, a legend like Shaquille O'Neal, had turned one of the worst days into the best day of their lives. Ethan bounced in his seat, practically vibrating with excitement. Daddy, can I blow out the candle now? Jake chuckled. Go ahead, buddy. Make a wish. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, whispering something under his breath before blowing out the candle in one big breath. Jake couldn't help but wonder, what did he wish for? As Ethan happily licked the frosting off his fingers, Jake leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. The past few years had been tough. Since losing his wife, he had struggled to keep things together. Paycheck to paycheck, worrying about rent, skipping meals so Ethan could eat. And yet, tonight, For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. And it was all because one man decided to step in. Jake looked down at his phone, his screen still open to Shaq's final message. Be kind. You never know who you're talking to. He swallowed the lump in his throat. He wasn't the kind of man to get emotional, but tonight, he was damn close. Ethan, now with frosting on his nose, grinned up at his father. Best birthday ever. Jake blinked rapidly, forcing down the burning behind his eyes. He reached over, ruffling his son's hair. Yeah, kiddo, he said, voice thick. Best birthday ever. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the warmth of the room wrapping around them like a hug. Then Ethan tilted his head. Daddy? Yeah, bud. The little boy hesitated before asking softly, what did Shaq whisper to me at the bakery? Jake raised an eyebrow. He whispered to you? Ethan nodded enthusiastically. He said, never let anyone tell you you're not worth it. Jake's breath hitched. For so long he had worried about not being enough, not being a good enough father, not being strong enough to give his son the life he deserved. But tonight, his son had learned something far more valuable than he ever expected, that his worth wasn't measured by money, that he was worthy of kindness, that no matter how tough things got, he should never, ever let the world make him feel less. Jake let out a shaky breath, nodding. Shaq's a wise man, kid. Ethan smiled proudly. Yeah, and he's really, really tall. Jake chuckled. That too. As the candle wax melted onto the plate, the weight of the entire day settled over Jake. The humiliation, the kindness, the lesson learned. And one truth stood out above all. True wealth isn't about money. It's about how much good you do with it. And Shaq, he was the richest man Jake had ever met.